Ever feel like you're drowning in headlines, just wanting someone to quickly, help you understand what's really going on with the economy globally and here at home? Well, that's exactly what we're doing today. We're going deep into the latest pulse of the Indian economy, pulling out the key insights from the RBI's recent State of the Economy report for June and July 2025. Our goal: simple. Cut through the noise for you. We'll shine a light on the big global trends and also zoom in on that domestic resilience India is showing right now. Get ready, because we've got some surprising facts and will really help you grasp why all this matters.
Yeah, and this RBI report, it's really quite something. It takes this massive amount of data and somehow boils it down into a clear picture. It's like getting a really sharp snapshot of this incredibly dynamic economy. Gives us a proper look at how India is doing, how it fits into the world picture, especially with the shifts in June and July this year.
Okay, so let's start with that global picture then. The macroeconomic environment. The report uses the word fluidity, which sounds, well, uncertain. What were the big international things happening in June and July?
Well, it was fascinating, actually, how fast sentiment could swing. Early June, you had these very serious worries about Iran and Israel, the geopolitical tensions really escalating. Markets got quite volatile, understandably. But then, bang, June 23rd, a ceasefire is announced. And almost instantly, things calmed down. Global markets breathes a sigh of relief. And interestingly, this sort of brief calm was helped along by some good news on bilateral trade deals, which added a bit of optimism back into the mix.
A sigh of relief, okay. But fluid suggests that relief maybe didn't last long? Were there other clouds gathering even after things seemed to calm down?
Absolutely. By early July, you started seeing new anxieties bubble up. There was chatter about the U.S. fiscal health, especially after this one big, beautiful bill, a big spending package. That, plus some higher-than-expected U.S. inflation data for June, well, it pushed up U.S. Treasury yields, signals concern about borrowing costs, right? And then hanging over everything was the approaching August 1st deadline for new U.S. import tariffs. That created this real undercurrent of uncertainty, even while those talks on trade deals with Vietnam, Indonesia, Japan, the Philippines were moving forward. It really felt like a tug of war.
Yeah, a real push and pull, optimism versus caution. So how did actual economic activity around the world reflect this tension?
Looking at the high-frequency data, global manufacturing actually saw a modest expansion in June. That was good news after contracting for 2 months. Services activity stayed pretty strong, though it may be eased off just a little. But here's the catch the report points out. Consumer and business confidence globally, still weak. That raised questions about how solid this rebound really was. Was it just technical, or was sentiment genuinely improving? It felt a bit fragile. On commodities, prices bounced back in June. Energy, metals, precious metals. Crude oil, predictably, dipped after the ceasefire. But gold, it rallied quite a bit in early June as people sought safety. Global food prices, though, stayed surprisingly steady through all this.
And central banks, how are they navigating all this fluidity? Must have been tricky.
Oh, definitely. Most central banks in the advanced economies, Canada, Japan, UK, US, they basically held steady, kept policy rates unchanged. Disinflation, prices not falling as fast as hoped, seemed a bit stickier than expected. Plus, they're waiting to see what happened with those trade tariffs, a cautious approach. But then you had the ECB, Sweden, Switzerland. They actually cut rates, citing moderating inflation or even deflation risks at home. And emerging markets, a real mixed bag. Mexico, Philippines, Russia cut rates. Yeah. But Brazil, they actually hiked rates because inflation pressures just wouldn't let up. It really shows the different pressures different places were facing.
Right. Okay, let's bring it home now. India. Despite all that global uncertainty, the report flags India's resilience. So what specific indicators, those high-frequency ones, really stood out in June showing this domestic strength?
It is quite striking how India's aggregate demand held up. E-way bills, tracking goods movement, strong growth, toll collections, same story, both clear signs of activity. Now, GST revenue growth did moderate sharply in June, but that was more due to a one-off settlement, so probably not a sign of underlying weakness there. Petroleum use saw modest growth. Electricity demand dipped slightly, but that was mainly because the monsoon arrived early, less need for AC. And digital transactions. Volume stayed robust. Value picked up too, even with UPI growth slowing a bit because RTGS, the large value system, saw more use. It all points to domestic demand being pretty solid.
Lots of signals there. What about digging down a bit, rural versus urban demand, and crucially, jobs? How did that picture look?
Yeah, on the ground, rural demand seemed resilient. Urban activity also showed signs of recovery. Car sales, retail auto sales, they moderated a touch but stayed above average. And tractor sales actually grew quite strongly. That's always a good indicator for rural sentiment, the farm sector. Demand for work under MG and RHS, the Rural Jobs Scheme, it stayed high, which just people were still needing that safety net during the pre-sowing lean season. And that connects right into the employment numbers. The overall all-India unemployment rate was steady at 5.6%, rural actually doing better than urban. We did see a slight dip in the labor force participation rate and the worker population ratio. Seasonal factors played a role there, farming cycles, the heat wave affecting outdoor work, also maybe some unpaid helpers, especially in better-off rural homes, shifting to domestic duties. But the organized sector, that looks strong. Job listings were up, especially in, AML, insurance, hospitality, real estate, and the PMI surveys. They showed hiring picking up in both manufacturing, hitting an all-time high in June, actually, and services. So a bit nuanced, but definite strength in the formal job market.
And the government's role in this resilience, you mentioned spending earlier. Was it just about collecting taxes, or was there strategic element to government finances?
Oh, very much strategic. The union government's finances actually improved in April, May. Key deficit numbers, gross, fiscal, revenue, primary, they all look better. Less borrowing needed, which is healthy. A big part of this was strong growth in capital expenditure, almost 20% of the budget estimate spent already. That's real front-loading. Basically, the government was pushing money into infrastructure, long-term projects early in the year. That really helps kickstart activity. And tax revenues, both direct and indirect, were up significantly too. Now, state governments, their deficits were a bit higher than last year. Revenue growth was a bit slower for them, and spending was up. But, and this is key, the union budget had that big euro 1.5 lakh crore provision for 50-year interest-free loans to states. That really helped boost their capital spending too. So a coordinated push on infrastructure investment across the board.
Okay, let's zero in on some specific sectors now. Trade first. How did India's imports and exports look in June? Were those global headwinds biting?
They definitely had an influence, yeah, but there were some positive aspects too. Merchandise exports dipped just slightly, 0.1%, down to about US $35 billion, partly driven by lower petroleum prices. Imports fell a bit more, 3.7%, to around US $54 billion. Lower gold import volumes and oil prices were the main factors there. But the good news, the merchandise trade deficit actually narrowed, came down to US $18.8 billion in June from over $20 billion a year ago. Both the oil and non-oil deficits got smaller. That's healthy for the external balance. And services. Net export earnings from services grew really strongly in May, up almost 24%. A big positive contribution.
Okay, switching to the supply side. Agriculture is always so critical. How did the monsoon shape up and what was happening with industry?
The agricultural outlook is looking quite positive right now. Big underlying strength for the economy. The monsoon covered the whole country 9 days early, and cumulative rainfall up to mid-July was actually 6% above normal. Reservoir levels, record high, 57% full. This early good monsoon really boosted Kharif sowing. That's the summer crop up over 4% compared to last year, covering about 65% of the normal area already. And wheat procurement, much higher this year, resulted in the biggest stockpile with the Food Corporation of India in 4 years. That's great for food security and should support rural incomes. The main index of industrial production, the IIP, it did slow down in May, hit a 9-month low. But the more recent high-frequency indicators for June suggest industrial activity was still ticking along modestly. PMI manufacturing showed steady expansion. And you saw strong growth in things like capital goods output and steel production. So even if the headline IP number looks soft, key industrial segments seemed okay.
Now, this is where the report highlights something really interesting, a major milestone for India on clean energy. It feels quite significant. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this really is an aha moment. It speaks volumes. India is not just leading clean energy investment among emerging markets, which is already impressive, but as of June 2025, non-fossil fuel sources, think solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, they now make up 50.1% of India's total installed power capacity. Why is that huge? Because India just met its 2030 target for non-fossil fuel capacity share 5 years early. 5 years ahead of schedule. It's a massive statement about their commitment to the energy transition.
Wow, that is impressive, especially for a country of India's size and stage of development. So with that backdrop, how did the services sector fare and construction?
Services kept up their strong momentum in June. The PMI Services Index hit its highest level in 10 months, driven by new business coming in and more hiring. That points to broad-based strength. And construction indicators, things like steel consumption, cement production, they also stayed robust in June. It fits that picture of the infrastructure push we talked about. These sectors are clearly benefiting.
All right, let's talk inflation. Always a hot topic. What's the latest from the report? Has it cooled down? And maybe more importantly, what's behind the numbers?
The inflation story is definitely one of the big positives for India right now. Headline CPI inflation dropped to 2.1% in June. That's the lowest it's been since January 2019. And crucially, it's the fifth month in a row it stayed below the 4% mark, which is the RBI's target ceiling. A lot of this drop was due to a favorable base effect, meaning prices were higher a year ago. That more than cancelled out some month-on-month price increases. And get this, for the first time since early 2019, the food group actually saw deflation. Prices fell by 0.2% year-on-year, driven mainly by vegetables, pulses, meat, and fish becoming cheaper. Cereals, fruits, milk also saw moderation. But, and there's always a but with inflation, right? Core inflation stripping out food and fuel that actually ticked up slightly to 4.4% in June, mostly due to a sharp rise in personal wear items, but also smaller increases in things like recreation, household goods, health services. So while food provided relief, some underlying price pressures, especially in services, are still there. Regionally, inflation eased in both rural and urban areas, but more so in rural. And most states, 31 out of 37, had inflation below 4%.
Looking ahead, the high-frequency data for July shows pulses prices continuing to fall, cereals picking up a bit, edible oils firming, and, potato, tomato, and onion prices rising again. Remind you how volatile food prices can be.
Okay, so easing headline inflation, but maybe some stickiness underneath in core. What did all this mean for money and finance in India? Did things feel easier? How did it flow through the system?
It certainly contributed to relatively easy financial conditions in June and July, yeah? System liquidity, basically. The amount of cash in the banking system stayed in surplus. That was helped by government spending, those lower GST collections we mentioned, and less currency being held by the public. With all this extra cash floating around, the RBI had to absorb quite a bit through its liquidity adjustment facility, using reverse repo auctions to soak up the excess. In the money market, the call rate, what banks charge each other overnight, it stayed very close to the floor of the RBI's target corridor, a clear sign of ample liquidity. The RBI even extended market hours for some transactions, trying to help develop the market further. Bond markets, though, saw yields harden a bit, especially at the longer end, so the yield curve steepened. That sometimes suggests investors expect higher rates or stronger growth down the line. But corporate bond issuance stayed strong, which is positive. And credit. Bank lending growth actually accelerated, 10.4% year-on-year. Deposit growth also picked up to 10.3%. Non-food credit slowed a touch, and lending to NBFCs contracted, but the NBFCs just tapped the capital markets more instead. So overall lending didn't seem constrained. Importantly, credit to MSMEs, small and medium businesses, stayed buoyant. And personal loans, especially for housing, were a really big driver. So people and smaller firms were still borrowing. And the RBI's past rate cuts, how do they filter through? Well, the 100 basis points cut in the repo rate since February, that fully passed through to loans linked to external benchmarks. Loans linked to banks' internal costs, the MCLR, saw a much smaller drop, only 10 basis points. But overall, average lending rates on new and existing loans did come down. Deposit rates also moderated. Some public sector bank savings rates even hit historic lows. Finally, equities. Indian stock markets did well in late June on positive global cues and the Mideast de-escalation. But July saw a bit of a negative bias trade deal uncertainty, mixed earnings reports. IPO activity, though, picked up. New companies were still coming to market.
Okay, last piece of the puzzle, India's external position, its buffers against global shocks. How's the balance of payments looking? Is India well cushioned?
Remarkably so, actually. The external sector has been a real source of strength, a shock absorber. India's current account balance, basically. The difference between its earnings and spending abroad, it recorded a surplus in the first quarter of this year. US $13.5 billion, or 1.3% of GDP. That's very healthy, driven by strong service exports and those remittances from Indians working overseas. For the whole previous fiscal year, the deficit was tiny, just 0.6% of GDP. India is largely paying its way internationally. Foreign direct investment. Gross inflows were decent in May, over $7 billion. Net inflows were much smaller, though, but portfolio investments saw net inflows of $2.4 billion in June, mostly into equities, helped by global liquidity and a weaker dollar. External commercial borrowings, companies borrowing abroad, registrations slowed, but net inflows were still positive, about $4.4 billion, and nearly half of that was earmarked for capital spending, which is productive. And the buffers. India's foreign exchange reserves are substantial, stood at nearly US $697 billion in mid-July. That's enough cover for over 11 months of imports, and it covers about 95% of India's total external debt.
Now, external debt did rise slightly to about US $736 billion, putting the debt-to-GDP ratio at 19.1%. But compared to other large emerging economies, India's vulnerability indicators look pretty comfortable. Even the rupee, while it weakened slightly against the dollar in June amid those tensions, it remained one of the least volatile major emerging market currencies. Its real effective exchange rate also dipped a bit, which could help exports.
So wrapping this all up, What's the big takeaway for you, the listener, trying to make sense of this complex picture? It seems like despite a really unpredictable global scene, with trade worries still looming for August, India's economy is showing some serious resilience, almost pushing back, wouldn't you say?
Indeed. I think the report really underscores that India's core macroeconomic fundamentals are strong. You add to that the easing inflation, the good monsoon prospects for agriculture, and that very deliberate government push on capital spending. All these things are coming together to create a pretty supportive financial environment, which in turn is bolstering overall demand.
Right. It's clear that while the world is kind of figuring out these shifts in trade and maybe even fragmentation, India's actively building its own strengths, hitting some big goals like that clean energy target. But here's something to chew on. The report hints that financial markets might be underpricing macroeconomic risk globally right now, despite all these ongoing uncertainties. So it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What could the next unexpected shock be? And how ready is the global system? And yes, countries like India, despite its resilience, how ready are we all to actually absorb it without major disruption? Definitely food for thought. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and stay well informed.